Gitelman, professor of political science, and Preston R. Tisch, professor of Judaic studies at the University of Michigan, studies ethnicity and politics, especially in former communist countries, as well as Israeli politics, East European politics, and Jewish political thought and behavior. His most recent book is Jewish Identities in Post-Communist Russia and Ukraine, An Uncertain Ethnicity, published by Cambridge University Press in 2012. It draws on two large surveys at the beginning and end of the 1990s that he conducted with two colleagues in Russia. Professor Gitelman's current project is on ethnic relations in the Soviet armed forces during the war and Soviet policy regarding the Holocaust. It is based on hundreds of oral testimonies of Soviet Jewish veterans of World War II and on Soviet archives. Gitelman's most recent edited volume is Religion or Ethnicity, the Evolution of Jewish Identities. He is editing a volume on the Russian-speaking Jewish diaspora, which is now 4 to 5 times as large as the Jewish population of the former Soviet Union. We are grateful to Professor Gitelman for traveling to New York to present his lecture, Victory and Disillusion, the Black Years of Soviet Jewry After the Holocaust. Please help me welcome Professor Tzvi Gitelman.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be back here. And I want to thank the organizers for having invited me once again. Until very recently, we knew much less about the Holocaust in the USSR than about those events in Poland or even in Slovakia or Holland, for example. And there are specific reasons for our long-term ignorance of what happened in the Soviet Union during the war. First of all, unlike in the case of Poland or Hungary especially, there were not many survivors who left the country after the war and came out to countries where they could speak freely. In the Soviet Union itself, they could not tell their stories. For political reasons, which perhaps we'll discuss a bit later, the Soviet Union, its authorities, were not interested in exploring the Shoah, the Holocaust, in their own country. So personal accounts begin to emerge only in the late 1970s, when, beginning with March 1971, an emigration of Soviet Jews began to occur, which grew, was then stopped, resumed, and by 2007 resulted in the emigration of 1.6 million Jews and their non-Jewish relatives. And this is why, as was referred to a moment ago, there are now 4 times as many Russian-speaking Jews who do not live in the former Soviet Union as those who do live there. The Soviet government discouraged research and writing about the Holocaust, though unlike some people in the West, it never denied it. There's no Holocaust denial in the Soviet Union. There is what I would say bypassing or suppression or willful ignoring of it. Archives were closed, and that was true of Soviet archives in general, even those relating to, let's say, 19th century events. Not a single comprehensive book on the Holocaust was published at any time, anywhere, in a country of 200 million people. In the West, survivors and their sympathizers constituted a group that had an interest in documenting, describing, analyzing, and memorializing the Shoah. There was no such group in the USSR. Why so? The Soviet Union on the eve of the war, and for the USSR, the war started on June 22nd, 1941. A year and a half after World War II started with the German invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939. On the eve of the war, the Soviet Union was in a mess. Stalin had taken power firmly in 1928. He had succeeded in modernizing and industrializing the Soviet Union at a pace hitherto unknown in any other country, but at a huge human cost. We think that about 8 million peasants, farm workers, were killed resisting the collectivization of agriculture. Because beginning in 1928, there was a campaign to take away land from the peasants and to force all agricultural workers into communes. And peasants wanted to hold on to their private property. Resistance meant imprisonment, exile, and probably in about 8 million cases, death. In 1934, lasting through 1940, this was the period of the Great Purges. People who were accused of being politically disloyal were arrested en masse. This is when the Gulag, the network of labor camps, was constructed. We don't know now, and we will never know, how many people were victimized by this. An educated guess is about 40 million. The result was, on the one hand, the rapid forced industrialization of what had been a backward agricultural country, but on the other, the creation of a terroristic system and a terrorized population, which had to be forced to do things that it would not otherwise do. In 1932-33, there was a famine, specifically in Ukraine. And today, Ukrainians call that famine the Holodomor. Okay, sure. In which, as part of the collectivization of agriculture, seed and other agricultural necessities were taken away from peasants, and the general estimate is that 3 million peasants in Ukraine died, most of them ethnic Ukrainians, which is why today Ukrainians refer to the Holodomor, to this famine, as their Holocaust, the Ukrainian Holocaust. There is a debate which is unresolved between Ukrainian historians and Russian historians, and as you know, there is a debate about other issues between Ukrainians and Russians today. Debate would be a mild term. About whether this was planned, whether this was engineered by Stalin specifically against Ukrainian people, or whether it happened in Ukraine more than elsewhere because Ukraine was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, supplying approximately 1/4 of all agricultural products in that country. As a result of the purges, collectivization, the Holodomor, the alienation of large numbers of Soviet citizens, you had a population which was frightened, terrorized, cowed, mobilized, patriotic, but a system which had many visible faults. The war solved that problem at huge cost. Approximately 26 million Soviet citizens died during the war. 26 million. But eventually the USSR emerged triumphant. And that meant, at least in the official interpretation, that the system had justified and proved itself. It had withstood the greatest military assault that the Nazis had launched anywhere in Europe. It had turned the tide of battle in 1943 at Stalingrad, and in May 1945, it had brought down the Nazi regime. Yes, with some help from the Western powers, and if you believe American movies, the US Army and the Normandy invasion single-handedly won the war, which is total nonsense. If you believe Soviet movies, the United States played a minor role mainly against Japan and was not involved in Europe. As they say in academia, the truth lies somewhere in between. Now, the war became the legitimizing myth of the system. If you emphasize the Holocaust, you are taking away from this legitimizing myth and you are introducing a discordant note. You are saying not that the Soviet people suffered terribly at the hands of the Nazis, but the Jews, one of 120 Soviet nationalities, somehow suffered more than the rest. No. This was a war of all the Soviet peoples united in friendship and brotherhood against the common enemy. That was the official line, and that was a line that discussing the Holocaust could only disturb. A final consideration that was likely to have impeded dealing with the Holocaust was that it would inevitably raise a very troublesome issue, one which is still troublesome 70 years after the war, and that is the collaboration with the Nazis by some Soviet citizens, particularly among Baltic peoples, Latvians, Estonians, and Lithuanians, and also by Ukrainians in large numbers, but also among Russians, Belarusians, and others. This would be very discomforting because it meant that the Soviet population was not united in the struggle against Nazism. Those are the reasons, I think, that the Holocaust was never a theme in poetry, literature, history, with one exception, and that is the Yiddish language. It was only in the Yiddish language that this subject could be discussed. And by the end of the Soviet Union, in the last census, January 1989, only 11% of the Jews of the Soviet Union gave Yiddish as their language. So Yiddish was a secret code. It was limited to people who knew anyway what had happened because they themselves were Jews and they were of an age to have personally experienced or have had relatives who purposely experienced the Holocaust. And therefore, among them it could be discussed because it was already known. Among the others, let's not touch that theme. The Nazis systematically murdered Soviet Jews in ways that readers of the Western literature are unfamiliar with. When we mention the word Holocaust, and you see it right at the entrance of the museum, the first image that pops up is Auschwitz. Very few Soviet Jews were killed in Auschwitz or in any other extermination camps. Rather, there were 4 German Einsatzgruppen, commandos, shock troops, killing squads, really what they were, groups A, B, C, and D, which were assigned to different portions of the USSR, and whose sole mission was killing Jews, communist officials, gypsies, and other enemies. Enemies to be broadly defined as one saw fit. A second type of unit, much more numerous than the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen had only about 3,000 people per unit, were the militarized battalions called German Order Police, Ordnungspolizei. And the third major killer was the Wehrmacht itself, the German army. Now, post-war Germans created a myth, which was quite comforting, that the atrocities that were committed in the course of the war were not committed by the army. They were committed by special units designated for that purpose. Beginning in the 1980s, German historians themselves began to uncover the uncomfortable truth that in fact the Wehrmacht was itself responsible for many of the atrocities. They participated on a large scale in the murder of their imagined and real enemies. The annihilation of Soviet Jewry could not have been done, or could have been done, but was not done by the Germans themselves. They relied very heavily on collaborators among the local population. We don't know how many Jews were killed in the Soviet Union during the war. Yitzhak Arad, whom we discussed just a few minutes ago, former head of the Yad Vashem Institute in Israel, estimates that 2,711,000 Jews who were Soviet citizens in June 1941 were murdered. Now, I'm making a distinction here, which is important. In 1939, there were about 3.5 million Jews in the Soviet Union. Between 1939 and 1941, the Soviet Union annexed the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all of eastern Poland, which became West Belarus and West Ukraine, and 2 territories from Romania, one known as Bukovina and the other as Bessarabia. Bukovina is today Ukraine, Bessarabia is the independent Republic of Moldova. The total of Jews from those territories was about 1.5 million, which means that on the 22nd of June, 1941, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, there were approximately 5 million Jews in the expanded USSR. Of that number, half, 2.7 million, were murdered. They were not shot, they were not gassed in death camps. They were shot close to their villages, towns, and cities. The best known example of this, perhaps the largest scale example, is of course Babi Yar, the ravine.
Yeah, I think I'll pull some pages off. Post.
Something like the page turner at a concert.
No, it's like a Soviet encyclopedia, remove page 612.
I, by contrast, am telling you the whole truth and nothing but the truth. At this ravine outside of Kiev, it's now well within the boundaries of the city of Kiev, which is capital of Ukraine. Between September 29th and 30th, in 2 days, 33,771 Jews were shot. How do we know? Because the Germans kept very meticulous records. 33,771 over 2 days, having been told to pack their goods for a trip eastward. They were going to be sent for labor, and they were to assemble at a certain point. This was done on the Jewish New Year. The Nazis usually picked Jewish holidays for massacres. They came together, they marched, thinking they were going to a train to be sent to the east, and instead they were machine gunned by Germans and local population. If 2.7 million died, that would make Jewish losses more than 10% of the Soviet total. We said 26 million. And Jews were only 2.5% of the Soviet Jewish population. So obviously, Jews were singled out and were overrepresented statistically, if you will, among those who died. Another aspect of the Shoah in the USSR, which is unique, this is the only country occupied by the Germans where a large number of Jews fought the Nazis. Not as Jews necessarily, but as members of that country's armed forces. About 500,000 Jews served in the Soviet military. The number is almost exactly the same as the number of American Jews who served in the American military. But there's a huge difference in their fate. Of the 500,000 Jews who served in the Soviet military, about 140,000 to 180,000 were killed in action. 1 out of every 3. Among the Jews, the 500,000 who served in the American military, between 8,000 and 10,000 died. And that reflects the larger picture. 9 million Soviet combatants, fighters, or killed in the war. How many Americans died during World War II in combat?
400,000.
About 400 to 500,000. Every one of them, too many. But put that number next to the 8 or 9 million who died in combat on the Soviet side. Was there anything special and particular about the motivations of those Jews who saw combat? And did it have any influence on their post-war experiences? I think the answer to both is yes. All soldiers have one aim: to survive. The second motivation is to help their primary group, their unit. And already in the 1940s, there were studies done, both of the German and the American armies, which showed that the main motivation for soldiers was not to fight for their state, for political ideals, but to protect their buddies, to help each other. Men don't go to war for abstract reasons or think about abstractions once they're there, says one. They go because everybody goes, because it seems right to go, and they fight because their buddies are fighting. One Soviet Jewish veteran whom I interviewed, Boris Zarevich, who lived now in Chicago, put it this way: we were friends. We loved each other. There was Sergeant Major Begashvili, a Georgian, and there was an Uzbek, Rustem Rustamov. I remember them perfectly. So many years have passed, but I remember them. We had a friendship that was a friendship of the front. This is not to the credit of Soviet rule. This is due to the camaraderie that is created in difficult circumstances. Some people fight for revenge, the desire for glory, even for the thrill of combat and the exercise of power. And I would say that Soviet Jews fought for much the same reason as all Soviet combatants did. But there were two options that others had that they did not. One option was to desert. In the first months of the war, when 800,000 Soviet soldiers were encircled, captured, and most of them killed, many Soviets threw away their weapons, abandoned their units and uniforms. As one person has observed, desertion rates were so high that no one could be sure of the numbers, let alone the breakdown of culprits by ethnic group. Poorly trained, woefully unequipped, completely surprised by the German invasion and rapid advance, Soviet soldiers panicked and fled. Jews could not do that. They could not surrender to the Germans because they would be killed immediately. They could not hide among the local population, as many Soviet deserters did, because the local population would turn them in. Not necessarily out of malice, but out of fear of what the Germans would do, and sometimes for a loaf of bread or some jam. A second option that they could not exercise, which others did, was to join a group collaborating with the Germans against the Soviet regime. There was, for example, an army called the Russian Army of Liberation, which was formed by a Soviet general who had deserted to the Nazis, Vlasov. Over 100,000 Soviet citizens from the Caucasus Mountains served in collaborationist units. Thousands of Ukrainians, many of them freed POWs. 16,000 Ukrainians in the SS, Waffen-SS Halichina, or Galician division, served the Germans, as did so-called Osttruppe, Eastern troops, and Hilfswillige, helpers, people who are willing to work with us. One estimate is that ex-Soviet citizens serving in the Wehrmacht totaled at least 500,000. The figure may have been closer to or as much as 1 million. Polizei, local police, concentration camp guards, other formations, in one way or another, worked with the Germans. That was an option not open to Jews. Did Jews have a Jewish motivation for fighting? Or were they fighting simply as Soviet people defending their homeland? It's very difficult to ascertain the subjective feelings of combatants, since in the Soviet military it was forbidden to keep diaries. Because if someone was captured and a diary was found, that would reveal sensitive information. Nevertheless, some people did. Moreover, we have now thousands of letters written from the front. Most of them are very routine, very short, and very personal. How's Masha doing? How's Mama doing? How's Pyotr doing in school? And all of them pass through military censorship. But we can extract some conclusions from these literatures. One motivation, which seemed to be quite strong among Jews, and I'm sure it was among others, was Soviet patriotism. I'll quote just from one letter. An obviously Jewish soldier, Israel Yosifovich Feyman, writes to his mama and papa, "I dream of only one thing, to answer the first call of our party and beloved Stalin, and with weapons in hand, defend our homeland, defend you, and defend the entire Soviet people." Feyman disappeared. He died in unknown circumstances, as did millions of others. Rem Salomonovich Altshuler writes to his father on May 17, 1943, "I'm no hero, but I would gladly die for the honor and the life of our motherland." Samuel Isakovich Taubin, "We'll manage. A Soviet person can endure anything, and that's only because we're hardened by Stalin's leadership." Now, we don't know whether that was written for the censor or whether he really meant it. In a few letters, there are people who express Jewish motivations for fighting. Wolf Yosifovich Zelyony was killed in Stalingrad at the age of 20, senior sergeant, writes in February 20th, 1943, "Dear Papachka and Mamachka, for the entire Soviet people, but especially for the Jewish people, this is a difficult time. Hitler's bloody hands want to enslave us and even worse, wipe us off the face of the earth, but he will not succeed. I am a son of the Jewish people, and conscious of all of that, I fight the enemy and courageously, not sparing any force and life for the national cause." Patriotism, loyalty to the Jewish people and their defense, and there's a third motivation that's never discussed. The perceived need to show others that Jews are not cowards and that they are brave and competent fighters. There is a long-standing myth in Europe, transferred to America, that Jews are weaklings and cowards, despite the fact that in the 19th and 20th centuries, many Jews had served in European armies, had been decorated and promoted. In the Russian Empire, however, the stereotype of the Jew as coward, weakling, and shirker was stronger than anywhere else. Because in the Russian Empire, unlike in France, Germany, or Austro-Hungary, or England, Jews could not be officers and could not make military careers. Think of Captain Dreyfus in France. He became a member of the general staff. That was impossible. You couldn't even be a lieutenant in the Russian army if you were Jewish. Moreover, on average, Russian Jews were more religiously observant than West European Jews, and the impossibility of observing the Jewish dietary laws and the Sabbath in the military was a greater problem for them. But the most influential event that created this image of Jew as evader was something that happened between 1827 and 1855. The then Tsar of Russia, Nicholas I, decreed that each Jewish community would have to deliver a certain number of Jewish boys to the army to serve for 25 years. Now, the Russian army did not need that many soldiers. It was the largest standing army in the world. Why did Jews have to serve for 25 years? And some of them began at the age of 12 in paramilitary units preparing for the military. This was not a military goal. This was an idea that by taking Jewish boys away from their families and putting them in far-flung military districts outside the Pale of Settlement to which 97% of the Jews were confined, over the 25-year period, they would be convinced to convert to Russian Orthodoxy, to Christianity. For Jews, this was a fate as bad as death. And the administration of this law caused tremendous upheaval within the Jewish community. Marxist historians say that this is the beginnings of class struggle among the Jews. Why? Each community got a quota, a number of Jewish boys who had to be delivered. So let's say this shtetl, this little town, had a quota of 20 boys. The army didn't care which boys they were. Didn't matter if it was Sammy or Abe. Just give me 20 boys. The community had to deliver them. So who do you think the community delivered? The children of the communal leaders? The children of the rich? The sons of the leading rabbis? No, the juvenile delinquents, the bums, the kids who hung around on the street corner, or its equivalent. Which meant that it was the poor Jews who paid the price. In turn, at least according to the Marxist interpretation, that split the community. Why are our children being taken and the children of the rich and of the communal leaders are being protected? We, again, don't know the numbers, but somewhere between 40 and 70,000 Jews served under those conditions, and many were indeed converted to Christianity. That made military service abhorrent to Russian Jews. Frightening, fearful, conversionary. Moreover, Jews were forbidden to own land. 80% of the population of the Russian Empire made its living from agriculture. Jews could not be peasants. Which meant not only were they deprived of access to the main income-producing profession or vocation, but they tended not to engage in physical agricultural work. And they looked to be weaker, more puny than the others, and therefore incapable of military service. Presumably because by the 20th century, the vast majority of American Jews who originated in the Russian Empire, the image of the Jew as shirker and coward transferred to the United States. One professor at the City College of New York was reported to have joked in the 1930s, "The battle hymn of the Jews is, 'Onward, Christian soldiers, will make the uniforms.'" The Jews were the tailors who didn't serve, the rest served. That's why Jews have taken particular pains to point to their participation in the military, especially during World War II. We have in Washington the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. We had books in the 1940s called Jews Fight Too. Well, what's surprising about that? Of course, Italians fight, Polish Americans fight, Japanese Americans who were interned in camps, they fight too. No, you had to point out that Jews also fight. 2 volumes published in 1947, American Jews in World War II. One American Jew wrote in his diary, Soldier, "I was keenly sensitive to the anti-Semitic assumptions that Jews could not be good soldiers or stomach hard physical work, and I was determined to give the lie to those opinions." A British veteran of World War II, Jewish, "Because I'm Jewish, I fight that much harder. And because I'm Jewish, I take greater risk to prove to the others that Jewish people are just as tough and as resolute as any other British soldier." So this, in the Soviet Union, this was the first generation of Soviet Jews, after the fall of Tsarism, who could demonstrate, number one, physical prowess. Sports, which had been discouraged by the rabbis, now became very, very popular. And the ability to serve in the army and to rise high in the army presented itself. That is why, beginning in the 1990s, when there was this massive Jewish emigration, we have a large number of books about Soviet Jewish heroes, multi-volume works listing Soviet Jewish combatants who died, and memoirs and brief accounts of what men and women did during the war. On my first visit to the Soviet Union, I spent 2 months in Moscow in 1966, and I went to the Lenin Library almost every day, and I saw a group of rather young Jews thumbing through the newspaper that was published in Yiddish during the war, and looking, and then pausing and writing down. And after a few days, I asked them, what are you guys doing? And they said, we are looking for accounts of Jews who were awarded medals for bravery. I said, why are you doing that? You're an American, you wouldn't understand. But why? Well, you see, people here, our friends, say Jews fought the war in Tashkent. Tashkent is the capital of Uzbekistan in Central Asia. And as you heard yesterday, I guess, from Eliana Adler, large numbers of Jews were either deported to or fled to Central Asia and behind the Ural Mountains, evacuated sometimes by Soviet authorities. And the impression was created that Jews did not serve at the front, and if they had medals, they, quote, bought them at the bazaar in Tashkent. And these young Soviet Jews, young in 1966, as I think I was too, were looking to dispel that myth. Benjamin Gordon, raised in Tashkent in a highly assimilated Jewish family, writes, as an ardent Jew, when I heard people saying that the Jews were going into hiding, I went to the draft board and I put in an application. Another volunteer, Anatoly Vodopyanov, 17 years old in 1944, in evacuation, writes, the mindset was that you are a Jew and you have to be where it is difficult in order to prove that you are no worse than anyone else and in order to give all that you can to your country. That's why I quit school and joined the army. Finally, Yosef Kvasha, the only way I ever understood my Jewishness was always to do my best, to serve, to fight, to work, so that nobody could say I don't do my job well, so that I would cast no shadow on my people. That's how I understood being Jewish. Abraham Lindenbaum in Chicago, that's why I always tried to do my best so no one could shove it in my face that I was Jewish, and that's why my division commander sent me to the most dangerous areas. They serve, they die, 2/3 survive, they come home. What happens? They experience 3 shocks. The first shock is that they discover that the war has not been just against the Soviet Union. It's been a war against the Jews. Some knew already during the war that the Nazis were carrying out mass annihilation. They read it in Soviet newspapers. They heard it from political officers who gave them daily news reports. Many didn't. And some discovered what had happened only when they went back to their hometowns, found no family, no friends, no Jews at all, or when they liberated areas which they knew had been centers of Jewish population and found them devoid of Jews. That was the first shock. The second shock was the treatment they received when they returned from the war. And the third was the onset of government-sponsored anti-Semitism just 3 years after the war. So let's look at these individually, briefly. A mountain Jew, a Jew from the Caucasus, so-called Tat Jews, wrote, I fought in Rostov. Rostov is a big city in the southern part of Russia on the Don River. And when we took over the zoo, we found 14,000 murdered Jews, their bodies in the zoo. That's where the Germans had rounded them up and shot them. I saw this and clenched my fists with rage at the sight of the bodies of women and children. The children. The children. Wolf Zalyony writes home, the Jewish people will yet avenge its daughters and sons. Boris Lvov recalled that when he saw what the Nazis had done to Jews in the occupied territories, it had, I quote, a frightening effect on me. I decided that if I were to take part in hand-to-hand combat, I would not take any prisoners. Why? It wasn't because I hated Germans. In my soul, I was an internationalist. Our family in general was international. We had family members who were Jews and Georgians, Russians, Ukrainians, even a Chuvash. But I lost the ability to approach the question analytically. It made no difference to me. I didn't take any prisoners. The sight, the smell, I would say, of what had happened enraged some people who took personal revenge. When Dmitry Rezin from Byelorussia learned in 1942 that both his grandmothers, his uncles, aunts, and cousins had been murdered, he said, we felt that this was now a fight for our own blood because the Germans were already killing Jews. And when we captured Germans, Rezin admits, we didn't treat them very kindly, knowing that they were killing people and burning villages. We weren't allowed to kill them, but we did what we had to. Lev Ganopolsky learned from Polish refugees in 1941 what the Germans were doing. And then sometime in 1944, I passed through my home area in Ukraine, and I came to know for the first time that all of them, not just my parents, but all my relatives had been exterminated. What can I say? I wanted revenge. Abram Galko fought because I considered it my responsibility, my motherland, I had to protect it, but I fought with greater ardor when I learned what the Germans were doing to the Jews, and I heard about it on the radio in 1942. When I arrived home in Kiev in 1944, I didn't even ask. I found a neighbor. She told me how she saw them off, told me everything in the smallest detail. That's why I hate the Germans to this day. I began hating the Germans. I was taking revenge on them. For some, it was the Holocaust that raised their Jewish consciousness. They had considered themselves ordinary Soviet citizens, above and beyond ethnicity. Ethnicity didn't matter anymore. This was the new world of friendship of the peoples. The war changed that. Israel Barsky, I considered myself a Russian because I grew up in a family where we had a Russian upbringing at school, Russian language, Russian literature, in Leningrad. In the city, everybody spoke only Russian. I never heard Yiddish. But I learned about the atrocities that the fascists committed against Jews, about the death camps they built, and my outlook changed very much. We Soviets ceased to be one people. We started differentiating ourselves from others, that is, Jews and other nationalities. The second shock, as I said, was coming home. They went back to their apartments. There were people living in them. People who said, you're supposed to be dead. We're not giving back this apartment. You know there's a terrible housing shortage. Indeed there was. We have no place to go. Get out of here. Even worse in some ways, psychologically, was going back to your former school or your former job and being told, no openings for you. What do you mean no openings for me? I lost my arm. You see, I fought. I sacrificed. Don't I deserve to be returned to my original position? Over the apartment issue, there were many lawsuits, conflicts, confrontations. Some veterans just conceded and looked for another place. Pyotr Rosenberg was atypical. On a brief leave from the army in 1943, he went to his apartment in Gitelman, which is a big city about an hour west of Kiev in Ukraine, and found that the neighbors had already taken all the stuff in the apartment, furniture, clothing, dishes. And he warned the new occupants that he would be back at the end of the war to reclaim the apartment. Indeed, in 1945, he came back and he asked the occupants to move. They refused. So he says, we just opened all the windows, tossed their garbage out of the window, took their apartment, and whitewashed the walls. After that, I went back to Kuibyshev in the evacuation, and I came back with my parents. There were, in fact, some incidents of shootings by Jews of non-Jews who refused to vacate or who had cursed them with, "Did you buy those medals in Tashkent?" It reached a point where the KGB in Kiev had to write a letter to Nikita Khrushchev, who had been first secretary of the Communist Party in Ukraine and later, of course, was secretary of the Soviet Communist Party from 1957 to 1964, to say, look, there's a danger of what we would call an urban riot in the city. Jews and others, we better quiet the situation down. And some veterans discovered that their schoolmates, friends, and neighbors had collaborated in the murder of Jews. Alexander Grin had 9 siblings before the war. Big family. During the Holodomor, page no longer here, but you, oh, there we go, right. During the Holodomor, his family took in a Ukrainian orphan. The child's parents had died of starvation. His name was Andriy. He was from a neighboring village. My father had been friends with his parents, but they died of starvation, and my father brought the boy home. There were 6 children in Andriy's family. 5 of them my father managed to set up at the local orphanage, but Andriy he brought home with him. I remember hearing my mother ask, Avram, what are we going to feed 11 children? And he answered, we're feeding 10 mouths now. We can squeeze in another one. So Andriy lived with us. He learned Yiddish. My father taught him a trade. Andriy and Alexander, who's telling the story, were the same age. Andriy was in the Soviet Navy, Alexander in the Army. Andriy was captured by the Germans, freed after agreeing to serve them as a policeman, returned home, and, quote, took part in the execution of 6 women, including my mother. Kids you went to school with, kids you sat next to, in this case a kid whom you adopted and saved from starvation, turned. How do you deal with that? What does it tell you about your place in the world and in society? Jobs. Mutal Margulis expected that when he got home from the war, they would all greet me with open arms. What happened was precisely the opposite. I wasn't able to find a job for a very long time. They would tell me, for example, there's a job open, come, be interviewed. When I came, I showed my passport, and on my passport it said, Jew. They told me, oh, sorry, the job's just been taken. But my Russian comrades in the unit during the war, they got me an apartment, they got me a job, because they were my friends from the army. So here you see these cross currents at work. As I said before, there were instances of grassroots anti-Semitism expressed in the years 1945 and beyond. Why? Why did anti-Semitism flourish precisely after such Jewish and anti-Jewish atrocities had been perpetrated? First of all, you have to remember that large parts of the Soviet Union were occupied for 3 years by the Germans, and the Germans bombarded the population with anti-Semitic propaganda. I could show you many posters and other evidence of the German theme that Bolshevism is a Jewish conspiracy. You suffered under the Bolsheviks. Therefore, the Jews are responsible for your suffering. We have come here, we Germans have come here to liberate you from Bolshevik suffering. Help us extirpate the Jewish communist conspiracy. And that had some resonance among some people. Secondly, people simply, I know this is hard to believe, but it's true, people simply had gotten used to seeing Jews murdered and humiliated. People got used to seeing slaves in America. People get used to seeing children starving in various countries around the world. Well, it happens there. Third, the Jews were supposedly gone. Their reappearance was unnatural. And in reaction to this upsurge of popular anti-Semitism, many became more consciously Jewish and socially Jewish. A former intelligence officer I interviewed in Detroit said, "I must say, when I returned, we quickly organized a circle of friends, 15 people, and unlike before the war, not one was a non-Jew. We always had these wonderful meetings and we celebrated holidays together and everything. I would call that defensive nationalism. We became interested in questions of Jewishness because of militant anti-Semitism. Plus, we felt that especially in Kiev, they did not go after those who had served the Germans as Polizei. Even as something as trifling as a lunch break at the factory where I worked, at a table for 4 sat 4 Jews. They didn't spread out. And if one Jew was sitting at a table, a second would definitely come up to him, and then there would eventually be 4 at the table. Jews were trying to get closer to each other, and Yiddish words began to slip into our conversation, even though none of us really knew Yiddish. An interest and an understanding that you were Jewish began to develop. So on the one hand, you have this uprising of anti-Semitism, and defensively, one might say, an increase in Jewish consciousness. The third and final shock. This can be timed exactly. The years 1948 to 1953 have become known as the Black Years of Soviet Jewry. This was anti-Semitism, not from below, not from the people, not spontaneous, but from the top, from the government. Policy imposed from above. All Yiddish institutions, newspapers, libraries, magazines, theaters, schools, were shut down in 1948. The best known Yiddish cultural figure, Shlomo Michoels, who was the director of the Moscow State Yiddish Theater, was asked to go to Minsk in January of 1948 to look over a local theater. He left the theater late at night. It was cold and snowy. A truck ran over him and he died. Terrible accident. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate murder. He was given a state funeral. He was lauded. But right after that, all of these Yiddish institutions were closed. And in 1956, it was revealed that this accident had been staged by the secret police. About 20 leading Jewish cultural and social figures who had been arrested in 1948 were tried, we now have the transcripts of their trials, and shot on the 12th of August, 1952. More broadly, there was what the Soviets called the anti-cosmopolitan campaign. Here you need a little lesson in Soviet vocabulary. to be an internationalist is a good thing. It means that Russians love Ukrainians, as we see now. Ukrainians love Crimeans, who love Georgians, Kazakhs, Jews, Chukchi, Chuvash, Lithuanians, Belarusians, all of the peoples of the Soviet Union. But cosmopolitanism is a bad thing, because that means you have no national loyalties. You are a person without a country, not to be trusted by any country and not loyal to any such. Jews were now labeled ruthless cosmopolitans, unreliable aliens. And newspaper articles began to appear with the original Jewish names of artists and writers and theater critics who had taken on Russian names to show these were not really Russians. These were Jews. Jews were demoted, expelled from leading positions, refused admissions to universities, purged from party positions. Pravda, the Communist Party newspaper, wrote, "Cosmopolitans without a homeland who know nothing of creative work, truth, and honor have infiltrated us like enemy saboteurs and spies. To open fire upon them, this is our patriotic duty. These people who lack a nation and a country impede the development of Soviet culture." The climax, or the nadir, if you will, was reached on January 13th, 1953, when an article appeared in Pravda with the title, the headline, "Murderers in White Coats." 13 doctors, leading physicians, working in the Kremlin, the bastion of Soviet government, were arrested on charges of having tried to medically murder Soviet leadership. 11 of the 13 were Jews. They were charged with being agents of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, JDC, which is still, thankfully, in operation. And that JDC, in turn, was called a CIA front. People stopped going to Jewish doctors. They were murderers in white coats. Who knows? They might poison you. And there was a general spread of fear of Jews and by Jews. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Nobel Prize-winning Soviet writer, who was at that time in prison camp in the Gulag, noted that there were many barracks being constructed suddenly in the Gulag. And rumors began to spread that there was going to be a mass deportation of Jews to the prison camps after this doctor's plot had been uncovered. It didn't happen. And it didn't happen for one reason only. In March of 1953, Stalin died. You could almost hear the collective sigh of relief among Jews of the Soviet Union. What was his motivation in all of this? I don't think we know. He had indeed deported what he considered untrustworthy nationalities before that. Poles, Balts, West Ukrainians in 1939-40. In 1940, ethnic Germans, en masse, were deported to Central Asia. Chechens. Why do you think there was the two Chechen wars in the 1990s and the 2000s? This Caucasian people was deported as well during the 40s. And Jews were now seen as untrustworthy because of their connections to the West. This was, after all, the period of the Cold War. America was the enemy, just as the Soviet Union was ours. Every Jew in the Soviet Union had a cousin in Chicago, maybe an uncle in Tel Aviv. Listen, there was a trial in 1951 in Czechoslovakia of Communist Party officials, one of whom was a Jew named Bedřich Geminder. And we have the transcript of the trial. And the judge says to Geminder, "Tell me, do you have any relatives abroad?" He says, "Yes." "Well, who are they?" He says, "Well, I have a brother." "Where is he?" "Santiago de Chile." "What does he do?" "He's a dentist." "Have you corresponded with your brother, the dentist in Santiago de Chile?" "Yes, after the war I wrote to him and I said I was alive." "Aha, alive, aha, aha." a Western spy. If you have a brother who's a dentist in Chile, what more proof would you need? The period of the Cold War was a period of extreme Russian chauvinism. I bet you didn't know this, but Russians were the first to invent aircraft, vitamins, penicillin, the electric light bulb, printing, steam engine, and, the unkindest cut of all for some of us, baseball. American baseball is a distortion of a Siberian game called lapti, which Russian villagers had played centuries before the Americans invented baseball, whether it was Abner Doubleday or anybody else. I say this, of course, all sarcastically, but that's what the Soviets were claiming in the late 1940s. And the final speculation about Stalin is that after the war, he suffered quite seriously from paranoia. After all, even before the war, he believed that some of his closest associates were conspiring against him. His wife had committed suicide. Some of his closest associates, he arranged for them to be murdered. It was not unreasonable in such a mind to think that the Jews were conspiring against him. The long-term effects of these episodes, these post-war shocks, are profound. Government anti-Semitism was sanctioned. It affected personnel policy in higher education and employment. After the war, Jews could no longer enter military academies, where they once had been quite prominent. They were no longer in the police, the diplomatic corps, nor did they occupy high positions in government or the party, Communist Party, which they had before the war. The message was very clear. Jews, yes, may not be rootless cosmopolitans, but they are second-class citizens. The Jewish movement for cultural revival, beginning in the 1960s, turned into a movement for emigration after the 1967 Middle East War, because a large proportion of Soviet Jews concluded that the country in which they were born, whose culture they had imbibed, and of which they were extremely proud, the state for which they had fought, the people among whom they lived, all of these had disowned them. And as I mentioned, between 1971 and 2007, roughly, 1.6 million Jews emigrated. The generation that had fought, bled, and died for the Soviet Union suffered immediately after the war through discrimination and experienced disillusion. Their children, their grandchildren, have mostly left the countries for which they had given their very best years. Thanks. Questions, comments?
The Jews that tried to emigrate out of Russia, out of the Soviet Union at the time, how did they receive passports? I mean, was the government willing to give them visas or passports to exit?
Good question. After 1924, the Soviet Union effectively barred emigration. People could not leave the country. The reasons for that are several. One is that emigration would mean that the Soviet Union is not the perfect society. If people wanted to leave for other places, that cast doubt on the Soviet ideological position. Secondly, the Soviets were very, very sensitive about the transfer of information. Now, you could understand if they didn't want to let an engineer go who knew how the SS-20 missile works. But for the Soviets, sensitive information would include, for example, the price of meat in the store, or whether an airplane had crashed in Siberia or a train wreck had occurred in Russia. These kinds of incidents and those kinds of facts were never published publicly. In 1975, the USSR stopped reporting to the World Health Organization the rate of infant mortality in the USSR because it had risen very high. largely, it is believed, as a result of spreading alcoholism among women. I give these as examples of things that you and I might consider to be non-privileged information, but in one way or another could be interpreted as embarrassing to the USSR. People who left and had in their minds, even if it's not written anywhere, this kind of information. That's a problem. And thirdly, how could you control this process? You know about chain migration. When X leaves a country for another, Y, the relative of X, or even the friend or coworker of X, is that much more likely to leave. However, in 1971, when some people began to demand to leave, or in 1967, the Soviet Union miscalculated and said, well, there are only a few crazy people who want to leave, let them go, and that'll solve the problem. These dissident voices will be silenced, and we'll get rid of them. They didn't understand that it was only the beginning of a spiral which would feed on itself. So then they faced increasing demands for emigration, and they didn't know what to do. They adopted a variety of means to try to control the emigration. Education tax. Ah, you got Soviet schooling for free, pay us back. Or refusal. You know state secrets. You know how much meat costs in the store. Ah, if one person is refused and as a consequence is fired from her job, then other people will think twice about wishing to emigrate. In 1975, however, the USSR signed the so-called Helsinki Accords, which in its basket 3, which guaranteed human rights, guaranteed the right of free emigration. Well, what were they going to do with that? So they limited emigration to 4 categories. Ethnic Germans, Jews, Armenians, and evangelical Christians. How'd they come up with that? Well, they said, we are, as everybody knows, a very humanitarian country. And Germans, Jews, and Armenians were separated, families were separated by the events of various wars. So we will allow family reunification to those peoples only. Evangelical Christians, they're just crazy fanatics. Let them go. Go someplace else. By implication, it meant that Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians had no grounds for family reunification. They wouldn't go. They stayed. So there was a game that was played between 1971 and I would say 1988, in which the Soviets allowed emigration but tried to control it. People protested against the controls, or some people gave up on emigration. In 1988, to his eternal credit, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, having adopted the policies of glasnost and perestroika, said, let him go. Anybody who wants to leave can leave. Now the problem became, who's going to take you in? Western Europe was panic-stricken at the thought of millions of Soviet citizens or people from other communist countries immigrating to their countries. Israel said, we will take in ethnic Jews and their non-Jewish relations. And that opened up a large gate to Jews. Germany took the ethnic Germans on the same grounds of historical roots. United States, France, other countries took in some of the evangelical Christians. So what you had was a period of no immigration, controlled immigration, open immigration, and that's what we have today. Long answer to short question.
Since we'll hear from Luba in a little while, I was wondering, is there anything particular that you would relate to about Jewish partisans?
Okay. Not a short answer.
I'm sorry, if it's asking too much.
No, it's not asking too much, but bear with me. As the Germans rolled through the western parts of the Soviet Union, the Soviet authorities encouraged, or actually commanded, some people in the military and particularly in the secret police to stay behind and live under German occupation in order to report on what's happening. As the Germans captured more and more Soviet soldiers, some of them escaped encirclement, being surrounded, fled POW camps, and took refuge in forests and woods and swamps. These came together to form the first partisan units in the summer of 1941. This was a random collection of people. They were joined also by some peasants living in villages which had been despoiled by the German invaders. And they were resentful, and they wanted to take up arms against the Germans. And finally, after the ghettos were established for Jews, some people, mostly young, mostly but not exclusively men, escaped from the ghettos and went to these partisan units. That is only the beginning of their problems. Partisan units had an understandable law or practice that only people who brought arms with them would be admitted. Otherwise, they were just mouths to feed. So that meant that Jews who escaped from ghettos, especially older people or very young people, would not be accepted into partisan units. And that knowledge began to spread among Jews, and so they tried desperately to acquire arms, not mainly to resist within the ghettos, but to escape to the partisans and to be accepted by them. Once they got into the partisans, they found that the units were completely independent of any political control. This was a chaotic period. Moscow had no control of what was going on in the field outside of the military. And each partisan unit seemed to have its own policies and its own attitudes toward Jews, many of which were negative, so that many of these people who joined the partisans tried to pass themselves off as non-Jews. Women had a particular problem. In the absence of any civil authority, and with supreme authority vested in the commander of a unit, women who had no protector, male protector, were subject to the whims and desires of the men in the units, especially their commanders. The result was that some so-called family partisan camps were formed. Camps of people, mainly women, the elderly, and children, who had no arms and were not fighting, but were merely trying to survive, and who were protected by men who were fighting. These were two groups of Jewish camps, one led by a shoemaker from Minsk named Shlomo Zorin, and the other far more publicized, the Bielski brothers. I think the movie was made out of, what is it called, Defiance or something? With its typical Hollywood nonsense touches, but it's a real story. And several thousand people survived in those camps. Alcoholism, criminality, and sexual abuse were common phenomena in the partisan units. By 1943, however, when the Soviets had counterattacked, they were able to gain control by literally parachuting people sent from Moscow to establish military discipline in the partisan units. And 1 year later, by 1944, having liberated all of Soviet territory and having marched into Poland and beyond, westward, the partisan units were dissolved and integrated into the Soviet army. So the lifetime of the partisans was about 3 years at most. Their main task was twofold. Well, onefold for the general partisans. Sabotage the Germans. Don't confront them in open battle, you're going to lose. Blow up trains, harass them, attack police posts, pin down German troops. For Jewish partisans, there was another mission, not always agreed upon by their general partisan commanders. There were about 12,000 Jewish partisans in the western part of the USSR. They saw their goal not only as harassing the Germans, but also liberating Jews from ghettos and bringing them out into the partisans, whether or not they had weapons. Because of the tensions between Jewish and non-Jewish partisans, separate Jewish units were formed in some instances, partisan units. Yiddish was the common language. This ran counter to Soviet ideology, and by 1943, those separate units had to integrate into the general units. Last point. Following the war and today, following 1991 and until the present time, the small Republic of Belarus, with its 10 million inhabitants, calls itself the Partisan Republic because one out of every 4 inhabitants of Belarus during the war was killed. Many of them Jews, but many of them non-Jews. And it was in Belarus, with its swamps and its forests and its difficult terrain, that the partisan resistance was most successful. They pride themselves on that. But when you look deeper into the history of the partisans, you see that they were not as heroic and as people of unalloyed virtue as the current mythology makes them out to be. Complicated story, and it's one that changes over time. And I'll leave that one at that.